Hi everybody, thank you for joining us this morning. We are a couple of minutes to start time, so we'll just hang on and wait for some other people to join us before we get started. So thank you to those of us joining us. We're due to start at 11, so we'll just wait a couple of minutes just to allow people time to join. So we'll just wait another minute or so before we get started. So thank you to those of you joining us for this employment law update. We're just waiting for people to come in as we hit 11 o'clock. So we'll just wait for another minute or so before we get started. Thanks to everybody joining us. We're just waiting for people coming in as they're joining us, just as we're a little shy of 11 o'clock. So we'll get started shortly. Thank you to those of you joining us. We've just sort of passed 11 o'clock, so we're just going to hang on because I can see lots of people joining the meeting. So we'll just hang on a few more moments before we get started, just to allow people into the event. Morning to those of you just joining us. We literally just hanging on a couple of seconds, just as a few people still joining. So we haven't started yet. We'll get started in a few seconds. We're just letting people join. I can see people still coming into the event, so we'll just hang on a few seconds more. Okay, I think we'll get started then. People are still sort of joining us as we go along, but we'll get started. So welcome to this employment law update. Just as introductions to start with, so I'm Alison Smith. I'm CEO and lead consultant at Roots HR, and it's myself and my colleague Jimmy, who is Jimmy Van Santen, the Comply Services Manager and consultant at Roots HR, who are delivering this webinar for you today. Just to let you know that the Q&A is enabled. So if you have any questions as we're going through the event, hopefully at the top on your screen, you should see a little Q&A button. So you can just click that button and ask questions there. Alternatively, you can use the chat function, but really helpful if we can pop questions in the Q&A. So we'll get started. We'll try and answer questions as we're going through the session, but also hopefully if there's any questions, we can run through those at the end. But thank you for joining us today. So this is an employment law update by Roots HR. So we're the UK specialist consultancy for HR for the social sector. We operate as a social enterprise ourselves, and we provide high quality and affordable HR services into the social sector. And we're the only HR consultancy in the UK that uses our trading surpluses to provide pro bono free HR services to leaders and managers in the social sector. as well as learning and development under the umbrella of our Roots HR Academy. So we're delighted to be able to bring you this free employment law webinar today. And there's lots of other ways that you can access free HR support from ourselves, including accessing up to an hour of free HR consultancy. All our free resources can be accessed via our website, and details of those are on the sort of final slide of this presentation. But in regards of today and what we're going to cover during this webinar, we're going to look at some of the changes that are happening in April, so next month, so particularly around things like statutory rate changes. We're also going to touch on the employer's national insurance contributions, which I'm sure most of you have heard of, that came up in the autumn budget. We'll also make sure that you're aware of the introduction of neonatal care leave and pay. And then we're also going to talk about the big one, the Employment Rights Bill, what we know about that so far, which is a big sort of but there, the so far, what we know so far. So those are the things that we're going to cover off today. And I'll start the session by just going through some of the things that we know are happening and the changes that we know are coming up in next month in April. So first of all, we've got some statutory rate changes, and these statutory rates are reviewed annually and they typically increase every April. So hopefully this isn't anything that's sort of new to you. But on screen, you can see the increases for statutory payments for family leave. So that's the maternity, adoption, paternity and shared parental leave pay. And also for sickness absence, so statutory sick pay. So you can see that family leave pay, the statutory rates will be increasing to £187.18 a week, and the sick pay, statutory sick pay, will be increasing to £118.75 a week. One change that we don't yet have is the proposed increase to the cap for the calculations of a week's pay, which is typically used for things such as calculating redundancy pay. I checked this morning just to be very up to date to see if it's been announced yet, and it hasn't. So the current cap is £700 per week. We don't yet have the information on what the cap will be come 6th of April. So this is just something to be mindful of if you are going through any restructures at the moment that may involve sort of redundancies. You know, if you're looking at an end date of employment being from 6th of April onwards, then we don't yet know what that cap on a week's pay is for those statutory redundancy pay calculations. So everything will be on the gov.uk website as and when it's announced, but please bear that in mind if you are going through any changes at the moment, any restructures with potential redundancies. Also reviewed annually is the national minimum wage, which includes the national living wage. And again, those rates are on screen. These are the hourly rates. So for anybody aged 21 and over, the national living wage increase will be to £12.21 an hour. You can see the other bandings on screen and the 25-26 rates. And it is the aim of the government to kind of reduce the number of age bandings and the difference in pay. So we'll probably see at some stage, maybe next year onwards, elimination potentially of that sort of 18 to 20 bracket. But we'll see what happens. But those are the changes that are coming in from April of this year. In regards to national insurance changes, and this is the employer contribution, these changes were announced in the autumn of 20. Yes.
Sorry, I think we have people saying I can't see the slides at the moment.
Right, okay.
Is anyone able to see the slides? I think that might be a question to ask.
Yes.
Some people can, some people cannot.
Yeah. Yeah, we're getting thumbs up and people saying that they can see them. If you can't see them, it might be a question of it could potentially be the view that you're using. And I think if you go into I can't see those.
There is a focus on content view.
Yes.
So I suggest you might try that one.
Yeah.
And if you have clicked pop out, it might be on a separate screen or a separate window. So it's worth checking if you've done that. But I'm glad people can see it. I got worried that no one was able to see it.
Yeah, me too then when you said. So yeah, lots of people saying yes, they can see them, so that's great. If you can't see them, even if you access through content view, then we will be sharing a recording of the webinar anyway. So you can stay, listen to what we're saying, and then you will get the content with the slides attached as well. So you'll still get access to all of the information. But I'll thank you for checking on that, Jimmy. So national insurance changes. So as I say, these were announced in the autumn 2024 budget, and it's essentially effective for employer, so national insurance employer contribution rates. And I'm sure we're aware of these, but the changes were that the earnings threshold, so the threshold at the point at which employer national insurance contributions are required, is going to reduce from £9,100 to £5,000. And then the contribution level that the employer has to make will increase from 13.8% to 15%. So essentially, this means that employers will be paying a higher contribution rate on a larger proportion of the individual's earnings. To somewhat offset that, what was also announced was that the employment allowance that organisations can claim is being increased from £5,000 a year to £10,500 a year, with more organisations now being eligible to access that. And you can, if you're not sure about your eligibility, you can find out if you're eligible via the HMRC website. But those are the big changes in employers' national insurance. And obviously, what employers are seeing is that those changes, along with things like increases in the national minimum wage rates, will probably see their overall sort of payroll workforce costs increasing. But it's important to be aware of, and please do check if you're unsure whether you're entitled to that employment allowance. You can check on the HMRC website on gov.uk. So those are the national insurance changes. The other thing that's being implemented or changing that we're aware of and that we know from April, so from next month, is the introduction of neonatal care leave and pay. So this is the introduction of up to 12 weeks of statutory leave and pay for parents whose child requires neonatal care. To qualify for neonatal care leave, the baby must be born after the 6th of April 2025. So it doesn't apply to any parents of children born prior to those dates. And there are some sort of 3 very narrow categories of medical care which will count as neonatal care. So it's any medical care received in a hospital, medical care received elsewhere following discharge from hospital. That care must be under the direction of a consultant and include ongoing sort of monitoring and visits to the child by healthcare professionals, or palliative care. And to qualify for neonatal care leave, at the birth of the baby, your employee must be either one of the baby's parents, the baby's intended parents, that's applicable for surrogacy, or partner with the baby's mother, with the expectation that they're going to have a responsibility for raising the child. And similar principles apply if this is an adoption. The neonatal care leave must have taken place or begun within the first 28 days of birth, and the neonatal care must continue for periods of at least 7 continuous days. Neonatal care pay is paid at the same rate as statutory maternity pay, and employees are eligible based on their length of service and their earnings over a clearly defined period of time, in exactly the same way as eligibility for maternity pay is determined. Somebody just asked, can I repeat the eligible birth date? It's 6th of April 2025. So it's for any children who are in receipt of neonatal care where the child is born after the 6th of April, so on or after the 6th of April. There are actually going to be 2 tiers of leave. So they're calling them tiers, and there's tier 1 and tier 2. Essentially, in total, any neonatal care leave must be taken within 68 weeks of the baby's birth, or placement if it's an adoption. The idea of the tiers is the fact that we have tier 1, which begins when the child receives care and ends on the 7th day after the child stops care. Or we have tier 2, which is any time after tier 1, but it must be taken before the end of the 68th week after the child's birth. The reason for this is that tier 2 will typically be taken after the end of the employee's period of family leave, so maternity leave, adoption leave, paternity leave. And this is because an employee whose baby is admitted to neonatal care is highly likely at that time to be on some other family leave. So maternity leave, adoption leave, paternity leave. So the idea is that then they would be able to take their tier 2 leave at the end of their planned family leave. So for example, at the end of their maternity, adoption or paternity leave. However, because there are going to be situations, perhaps more emergency situations, when the employee isn't already on leave, most likely going to be for the father or partner, where paternity leave is obviously a much shorter duration, then the neonatal care leave might be taken while after paternity leave has run out and while the baby is still in hospital. So that's why we've got this differentiation of these 2 tiers, which is, tier 1 more likely to be applicable to either a father or a partner because their paternity leave period is much shorter. Tier 2 is probably going to be much more likely to be taken by employees who have already been on maternity leave or adoption leave at the point at which the neonatal care takes place. So that's why we've got these sort of different tiers available. There's different levels of notice that employees will be required to give to you to take the neonatal care leave. And the difference is, again, just because of that, likelihood that tier 1 leave is likely to be more emergency, more immediate requirement, particularly if it's for a father or partner after, their sort of 2 weeks of statutory paternity leave has expired. So different notice periods are required. Somebody's just asked a question, I've just seen that pop up, about whether if you have, whether both employees are entitled to the leave and pay. The answer to that would be yes, it would be for both parents. Okay, so that's the neonatal care leave and pay that is coming in. So I'm going to hand over to Jimmy now, and he's going to take you through and talk through the Employment Rights Bill.
Amazing. Thanks, Alison. So yes, the Employment Rights Bill, a very exciting piece of legislation that's going to be introduced here in the UK. That's going to change quite the landscape of the employment legislation and how we do HR in our organizations. Now, it was announced back in October last year, and it was kind of following the election promises by a Labour government, what they wanted to do with the HR legislation. And they are currently going through the consultation period. So they've announced what they want to do. They then start to consult with businesses, trade unions, just to see, if this is actually workable and what kind of shape these pieces of changes should take. And we get regular updates from the government on what they're planning to do. And actually last week on the 4th of March, they actually sent out what they call amendments to their bill. These are kind of changes as a result of the consultation with other organizations and trade unions. And so we've incorporated those amendments into this session, so you are completely up to date of what's going on and what's going to happen. I should say that obviously between now and when these changes are supposed to come into effect, loads of things can still change because it's still under consultation. It still needs to go through Parliament for voting. So we don't know what the end result is going to look like. All we know is what the government wants to do in the coming year. So there's a few elements that they have said they're going to change and that they want to introduce. And so we're going to go through them in detail in a minute. But essentially what we're going to see some more day one rights. So we're going to remove statutory waiting periods and all moving up to day one. We're going to see the introduction potentially of statutory probation periods. We're going to see changes to the way statutory sick pay is applied. We're going to see some extended bereavement leave rights. Obviously the big ticket item, 0-hour contracts, are they going to be banned or are they going to be kind of restricted? We're going to talk about that in a bit as well. The practice of fire rehire, the government really wants to stop that loophole from taking place. I'm going to put some really serious restrictions in place to prevent that from being misused. Flexible working, what's going to happen with that, and redundancy consultation. There are a few changes coming into place on that as well, specifically around collective consultation. So let's have a look at our first day one right, because at the moment, if an employee wants to take their employer to a tribunal for unfair dismissal, they have to be employed continuously by the same employer for 24 months or 2 years. And they cannot take the employee to a tribunal for unfair dismissal if they don't have that 2 years employment. Now, there are exceptions. There are currently also some what they call automatic unfair dismissal claims. So, for example, if you were dismissed for a discriminatory reason, or you were dismissed because you raised questions about your pay, those are automatic unfair dismissal claims. You don't need minimum service for that. You can go straight to a tribunal to make a claim. But what the government wants to do is essentially say, you know what, all claims, including unfair dismissal claims, should be done from day one. In other words, I can come to work, first day of employment, I'm being mistreated, I want to leave, and I can go to a tribunal claim unfair dismissal. That will be possible under the new legislation if it comes into force. And so from what they say autumn 2026, and we anticipate that to be around October 2026, employees will essentially be able to take their employee to a tribunal for unfair dismissal from the very first day of their employment. And that has some effect already for employees starting between now and October 2026, because essentially what they've said is that anyone from October 2026 or autumn 2026 can take their employee to a tribunal regardless of the length of service. So that means someone starting on the 1st of April would only need 16 months continuous employment before they can take their employee to a tribunal if the law comes into force on the 1st of October 2026. Now, what does that mean? It means simply that employees are going to have to follow the right processes and make sure that all dismissals are fair, that if someone is underperforming, you need to take them through a performance review process, disciplinary process if they are misbehaving, and actually make sure you follow the right process and the fair processes for anyone, regardless of the length of service. Now, that's something we already recommend to our clients, that they follow that right process because it's best practice. But there are situations where that sometimes is not applicable or not suitable, and therefore you now have the option to kind of bypass that without the risk of an unfair dismissal claim. From autumn 2026, that's no longer possible. So just bear that in mind as we get close to that date. Now, as a result of that unfair dismissal day one claim, the government is also introducing what they call a statutory probation period, or an initial period of employment. And essentially what that means is that at the moment, probation is contractual. It's not set out in legislation what that looks like or how employers should handle that. It's very much down to the employer to work out how long a probation period is and how they want to handle that probation review within that period, and then how to make a decision in the end, whether they want to continue with the employee or whether they need to extend or dismiss the employee. But because it becomes an unfair dismissal right from day one, the government has said that there should be some kind of period for employers to assess the suitability of an employee when they start their job in your organization. Now, we don't know the full details of what that looks like and how they're going to legislate this. We fully anticipate that, as I said, it will be a 9-month period, and there'll probably be some process that's kind of limited in scope on how you can assess someone's suitability and when it would be fair to dismiss an employee based on their capability or their conduct. And as those details become available, we will let you know. But I think the most important thing here to understand is that there will be a 9-month or an up to 9-month probation period to essentially still allow employers to assess suitability of employees as they start with your organization. So that's, I think, really good because it gives that flexibility for employers as well without the risk of always being taken to a tribunal for unfair dismissal. Yeah, if we go to the next slide, Alison. So we have more day one rights to leave and pay as well. So at the moment, a lot of rights to statutory pay require a minimum amount of continuous service. So if you want to, for example, access maternity pay or parental leave pay, you need to have 26 weeks continuous service by the 15th week of the pregnancy, for example, or by the week that the child is placed with you. And so that will be removed, and it will move to a day one right. So you no longer need to be continuously employed in order to access that pay. And that would also apply locally to the paternity leave. At the moment, again, for paternity leave, you need 26 weeks continuous service. That would likely be removed as well and become a day one right. And what that actually means is that essentially someone could start with you, and within the same week, they might leave for maternity leave and then also get pay as long as they're eligible, because of course there's all eligibility criteria attached to that, and then they should be able to receive pay and leave from the new employer. Now, we didn't see an update on this last week, so we fully anticipate that this will go ahead as it is, that it will be a day one right. But again, things might change between now and 2026. But I think it's a really nice right to have. It allows people to move freely between employers more without losing the right to these kind of payments and leave. So that's really, really good. Now, while we talk about leave pay, statutory sick pay is also changing. Now, we're going to see some changes from next month onwards. The eligibility criteria is going to be increased to £125 per week. So employees need to earn at least £125 per week in order to be eligible for statutory sick pay. And the SSP rates will increase to £118.75 from £116.75, so it's going to go up by £2. In 2026, the government again is planning to introduce some changes to the way statutory sick pay works. So it becomes entitlement from day one. At the moment, people have to wait 3 days, and then from the 4th day, they'll be entitled to statutory sick pay. That will be removed, and it moves to a day one right. The other thing that kind of is going to be changed is that £125 per week eligibility criteria. It will still be in place, but those earning less than £125 per week will be still entitled to statutory sick pay at 80% of their salary. So no matter how much you earn, you will be eligible to statutory sick pay, but there'll be two rates. One is either £180.75 if they earn £125 at least, or 80% of their salary if they earn less than the £125, or whatever amount will be introduced in the future. So that's really good, because that means that everyone now has entitlement to statutory sick pay, and there is no longer a need to wait to get statutory sick pay, which would hopefully avoid people coming into the workplace when they're sick, which obviously presents much greater issues in the long run. So that's on statutory sick pay. Another thing that will change is bereavement leave. And actually, we're seeing two changes here being introduced by the government. So at the moment, the government has already in place something called parental bereavement leave. That's 2 weeks leave for working parents who have children up to the age of 18. And applies anywhere from 24 weeks of pregnancy. So if, for example, there's a miscarriage or the child dies when it's born really early, from 24th week of pregnancy, parents are entitled to parental bereavement leave. And if it happens within that pregnancy, then parents are still entitled to maternity leave and paternity leave as well, in addition to that parental bereavement leave. And parental bereavement leave is paid at the same rate as maternity pay or parental pay or any kind of family leave pay. Now, what the government is planning to do is they want to extend that right for the whole duration of the pregnancy. So anywhere before the 24 weeks, if there's a miscarriage as well, likely will be that will be extended to those situations as well. And parents who then have to obviously go through that bereavement are then entitled to 2 weeks of that bereavement leave and pay, which is really good, because of course it's always hard no matter when you lose the baby. There will be an additional bereavement leave introduced as well. So most organizations that we work with, they will have some form of compassionate leave already in place, whether that's paid or unpaid, but usually there's a few days attached to that people can take time off if a close family member dies or maybe a close friend passes away. But but there's nothing in the legislation that actually gives employees the right to that kind of leave. And so what the government has said they want to do is they want to introduce a 1 week unpaid bereavement leave, regardless, well, not regardless, regardless whether you're a parent or not. But we don't know what the criteria would be for who this applies to. So would it be applying only to deaths within the nuclear family, within the direct family, indirect family? We don't know how far that goes. But what we do know is that they want to introduce a 1 week unpaid bereavement leave, which essentially is compassionate leave, as we often refer to it. But in the statutory case, it'll be unpaid. Now, of course, going forward, many organizations already offer paid leave, and so you can just continue with that. But the important thing here is that 1 week will become a statutory right to take leave if someone passes away. 0-hour contracts. So this is actually obviously a very big thing, and we get a lot of clients asking questions about it, saying, well, hey, look, what's going on? We have 0-hour contracts in place. They're very helpful because they deal with kind of ebbs and flows of the work that's coming in, and we don't really know how we're going to handle that if we don't have the 0-hour contract in place. Now, I think the government is hearing this, and what we are seeing slightly maybe is a bit of a change in language. So in the beginning, it was all about banning the 0-hour contracts, and they might still go ahead with that. It's too early to tell, but we do see a slight change in the way they kind of frame this and use the language around this. And it looks like more now that they want to move towards restricting 0-hour contracts. And that means giving employees who are workers that are on 0-hour contracts more rights, and are actually, trying to kind of help those individuals who don't have that predictability of hours within their working week and therefore income. So what we are seeing potentially is that all workers, including agency workers, will potentially be able to request contracts that have fixed hours in the contract. That's more for people, for example, if they're on a 0-hour contract and they're consistently working, say a minimum of 10 hours a week, then they should be able to request a contract for at least 10 hours a week. And if those, for example, were happening on the same day, they could even ask for a predictable work pattern, for example, if they always work those hours on a Monday and a Tuesday. Again, the details of that are very kind of scarce on this. We did see a piece of legislation that was supposed to be introduced last September that was very similar to this, and for some reason they didn't go ahead with it. But that was the Predictable Working Pattern Act, which essentially did the very same thing. Employees were able to ask for a more predictable working pattern based on the hours that they were actually working, not on the contract that they already had in place. Now, one thing we might see as well is the removal of the worker status. So at the moment in the UK, we have kind of the three main employment status: employee, self-employed, and worker. An employee is essentially, there's a mutuality of obligation. I give you a certain amount of hours of my time, and the employer gives a certain amount of money in return. And I have to work those hours personally. I have to deliver the work. I cannot ask someone else to do that. Self-employed people, they can ask someone else to do that, and there is no mutuality obligation. So there's no obligation on the employer to provide work, and there's no obligation on the self-employed person to accept the work. And as I said, they can kind of hand off the work to someone else as a substitute, which is kind of one of the key elements of a self-employed status. The worker status is kind of in the middle, because there's no mutuality of obligation, but they have to deliver the work personally if they agreed on the work or the shifts that they've been offered. And so the plan is to remove that status, because status always comes with less rights than an employee, and so it's a bit of a messy status at the moment, and so we are likely seeing the removal of the worker status, which means that any worker that will be in place by the time this becomes law, if it becomes law, would become an employee, most likely automatically or through some kind of process. Other provisions that might be introduced for 0-hour contract people is that there might be some compensation if, for example, an employer decides to cancel a shift or change a shift. So if, for example, they agreed on a shift on a Thursday and you decide to change that on the Thursday morning because I know you had a cancellation and you no longer need their services, then they should be able to access some kind of compensation for not working those hours. Again, what that would look like in detail is kind of unknown at this point, but we do know they're looking at some kind of compensation scheme for those employees working on 0-hour contracts. And we're also expecting broader consultation in the coming months on things like reference period, exceptions to the right, and what constitutes a low-hour contract. We don't know what that's going to look like at all at the moment. Of course, one of the things that a lot of companies are even talking about is that if the zero-hour contract is banned, we might as offer a 1 hour contract. The government, of course, is very aware of that. And so if they really want to ban the 0 hour contract, they will also look at what that would look like in terms of a low hours contract and whether it needs to be restricted or whether there should be rules attached to that to make sure that employers cannot circumvent the ban of a 0 hour contract if that were to come in place. So 0 hour contracts, as I said, we don't fully know whether they're going to completely ban it, but it certainly looks like in the last few months that they're moving towards restricting it rather than banning it completely, which I think is very welcome news for a lot of employers. So then we have flexible working. Now, I think there's been quite a big thing in the news lately, and especially in the last few months, ever since the Employment Rights Bill has been announced, because especially Andrew Rayner keeps saying that they want to introduce flexible working by default. Now, what that actually means, we don't really know, because it's one of those kind of things where you think, okay, well, employees already have a lot of right of requesting flexible working, but does that mean that flexible working becomes a right in itself? That's something to be seen. What we do know is that last April, a lot of changes to the legislation happened that improved the right to make a request. So not the right to flexible working, but a right to make a request to flexible working. And just to kind of recap quickly what those changes were, essentially people were able to make a request for flexible working on day one of their employment. There was a previous 26-week waiting period. Now people can make a day one right to make a request. Instead of one request, they can now make 2 requests per year or per 12 months, because it's kind of a rolling 12 months. So people can make 2 requests. That's very helpful because a lot of employees, for example, are asked to work from home and then they realize they can work different hours. And so that would usually then be used as a second request. You must consult with the employee. So if you plan to not agree to the changes or to the request, then you must consult the employee. You can bypass the consultation if you are accepting their request. Our recommendation that you always consult, because of course it always gives you a beautiful opportunity to explain to them that if they want to work fewer hours, for example, that also comes with less pay and reduction in annual leave, all that kind of stuff. So it gives a good opportunity to discuss the request with the employee and the consequences of that. We always recommend you do it, because then also it doesn't always become obvious that when you want to consult, you're going to deny that request. Employees don't no longer need to actually explain how flexible working would work for the organization or the team. There used to be a kind of obligation on the employee to explain how this would work within the team or in the organization. That's been removed because the onus is now on the employer to work out how that could work and how it wouldn't work. And you must complete the whole process in 2 months. It was 3 months previously. You now have to do it in 2 months. And there are only 8 business reasons that you can deny someone's request. And they are quite broad, those business reasons, but they are limited to those 8, and you must be able to explain which those 8 applies and why. Now, they want to strengthen this even further. And so, as I said, they're going to introduce some kind of flexible working by default. That might mean that flexible work in itself becomes a right, but we don't know at this point yet. What we do know is that the government wants to introduce further kind of enhancements to the rights that already exist, and that when employees want to refuse someone's request, it must be reasonable and they must be able to explain why it is reasonable to refuse that request. To some degree, that it already happens because you've got those 8 business reasons, and you must be able to explain why those 8 business reasons, one of those 8 business reasons, apply to the refusal. But I'm guessing this is kind of going 1 step further, where you have to go into a bit more detail so the employee fully understands why that is not possible. We're nearly there. So redundancy. So things might be changing with the redundancy in terms of collective consultation specifically. Now, the government was planning to remove the one establishment rule from the collective consultation rule, because at the moment, the way collective consultation applies is that when you make 20 employees or more redundant within a 90-day period within a single or one establishment, you don't have to do collective consultation. If you have less than 20 employees, sorry, I should say this, if you make more than 20 people redundant within a 90-day period in one establishment, you have to do collective consultation. And that means either talk to your employee representatives, if you have one, or you have to start elections to get representatives in place who will then essentially be consulted on the redundancy first before you go into individual consultation. Now, if you fail to do that, at the moment, that employees can take it to a tribunal and they can claim up to 90 days of their weekly pay, which is currently capped at £700 per week. That might go up to 180 days going forward, which essentially means that the penalty is a lot higher and the risk of quitting the employer is much, much bigger if you don't do collective consultation well. Now, one thing they wanted to remove was the one establishment rule. They've now said that they will not change that. I think they've done the collective consultation they've done the consultation with businesses on this and realized that it's pretty much unworkable. Because essentially what I would have meant is if you had a large organization with multiple sites across the country, you would have to try to work out if you're going to make more than 20 people redundant in a 90-day period over all those sites, and then you would have to consult, and no one actually knew how that was going to work in a kind of orderly way. Luckily, they're not going to change that. I know that most organizations, especially in the charity sector, that probably will not apply, but it is important, of course, to know that if you ever have to make more than 20 people redundant, that is not being changed. One thing that we might do see, though, is the criteria that triggers collective consultation, which might change. As I said, at the moment, it's 20 people or more within the 90-day period in one establishment. The government might change that to multiple criteria. So it could, for example, be a percentage of the workforce being made redundant, and then it triggers a collective consultation. But again, we don't know what that looks like. All we know is that they've kind of hinted at potentially changing that criteria. And of course, once we know more, we'll let you know as well what that will look like. And then finally, we have fire and rehire. Now, this has been a few times in the news over the last few years, especially when large organizations did that with a large group of employees. Essentially, it's the practice of trying to force through a change in terms and conditions, often less favorable than what they are currently, where employees don't agree on those new terms and conditions. So then you dismiss them on their current contract and you rehire them immediately on a new contract. Now, if someone has more than 2 years service, at the moment, they could in theory claim unfair dismissal because they were technically dismissed, albeit for a very short period. And the problem with these kind of things is that it's kind of 50-50 for employees taking a chance here, because they wouldn't come back to employment, so they lose their employment, they would go to a tribunal, they have to wait for over a year to kind of find out if they win the case or not. And employees know this sometimes who abuse this kind of system. And so, employees can tend to get away with it a lot of times, albeit that, of course, it's not legally okay to do so. Now, what the government wants to do is they want to make this an automatic unfair dismissal matter. So if the employer cannot show good reasons to use the fire rehire methods, and the one reason they've given as being the only reason really is financial hardship, if you cannot demonstrate that, and you cannot evidence that, you've gone ahead with a fire rehire, it becomes an automatic unfair dismissal matter, which means that essentially it'll go straight to a tribunal, and then from the tribunal to figure out what they want to do with that dismissal. And of course, that then comes with an automatic dismissal award and whatever else follows from that. So just bearing in mind that the government essentially is not necessarily banning it, because they recognize that sometimes organizations are forced to follow this procedure in financial hardships, but they really want to limit the scope of it to ensure that organizations don't use this too often or unnecessary just for the sake of saving a few £1,000s here and there. So that's the end or the limit on fire rehire. And that is really us for today. Now, as Alison alluded to it earlier, we have free resources available that you can access, including this recording that will be online in the next few days on our website. We have free resources all around, from toolkits to fact sheets to blog posts and our employment law bulletin. And so please do come to our website, have a look at it. There are no strings attached to it. If you have any questions that you've wanted to ask, but you don't feel comfortable asking in this session, as Alison said, you have a free hour available. So contact us to see how you can access that free hour. Yeah, and we're just going to have a look at if there are any questions that needs to be answered, Alison.
Not at the moment. We're all up to date. There were a couple of questions that were asked in the chat and Q&A as we were going through, but hopefully I've answered those for people. But thank you, Lex, for that lovely comment. Just said, love the resources. Thank you. So yeah, as Jimmy said, you can access all those free resources on our website. So yeah, if anybody's got any final questions, please do pop them quickly in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll cover those off. Oh, there's one that's just come in. If an employee requests changes to working hours, wants to work 30 hours to take on care responsibilities, currently on a 37-hour-a-week contract, can they later ask for those hours back as in their contract, or can the employer refuse and use financial difficulties as an excuse? I mean, that sounds to me, Ali, like that would be two separate flexible working requests. So an initial flexible working request to work to reduce the hours from 37 hours a week to 30 hours a week. If there were then a subsequent flexible working request, so remember somebody can make up to 2 in 12 months, and they requested to go back to full-time hours, then that decision would have to be taken based on, you know, the organisation, the team as it is at that particular point. So at the point that the second flexible working request was received. So, you know, if there are reasons why that second flexible working request can't be accepted, and it fits with one of the 8 statutory reasons, and you follow the correct process in consulting with the employee and then writing to them to say why that can't be accommodated, then you know, that's the process that you would follow there. Hopefully that helps. Let me just have a look. I think we've just got another question that's come in. Bear with me. So does an employee now have to state why they want a flexible working request?
No, they don't have to explain. I mean, what would help if they do it from a reasonable adjustment point of view, it'd be helpful if they let you know that it's from that perspective as well. But there is no need for an employee to justify why they want flexible working, because it's available to anyone for any reason, really. And from an employee perspective, really what you want to look at is not necessarily the reason why they want it, but more, can you facilitate that within your current, within the organization and the team you've got available. So yeah, so they don't have to state it. It might help, but they don't have to.
Yeah. That's it for all the questions, but just thank you so much for attending, and thank you for all of the fabulous messages that you've put in chat about the session. Really pleased that everybody's enjoyed it. As Jimmy said, the recording will be on the website in a couple of days, and yeah, through the website please do access all of our other free resources. But thank you so much to everybody for attending today. That's been really great. Bye all.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Take care.